Business in fragile states. Well, first of all, to say that the rise of private development companies is impacting the way that humanitarian aid and development assistance are implemented. As a co-founder of Handicap International, recently renamed Humanity and Inclusion, my perspective stems from a 40 years commitment in conflict, post-conflict, or fragile state settings. From the promotion of the duty of assistance to wounded, disabled, and vulnerable persons in emergency situations, HI broadened its mission over the years to include socio-economic support to the most fragile segment of affected population during the reconstruction phase. Our range of action also led HI to be, as a co-founder of ICBL, one of the main stakeholders in the Ottawa process, which banned anti-personnel landmines, and then the Oslo process, which outlawed cluster munitions. And today, as a member of ANU, HI is promoting the Stop Bombing Civilians campaign, whose goal is the adoption of a political declaration by members of the UN to restore compliance with the rules of military engagement. Martin Barber, former United Nations Mine Action Service Director, and Mark Bowden were present with us, and I, in our personal capacity this time, are engaged in the UAI Global Initiative, United Against Inhumanity, a fast-growing movement of experienced humanitarians, more or less 500 today, with call to action has been included in your digital file, courtesy of the organizers. The call is a straightforward invitation to all, including watchers or bystanders, to participate. For businesses, it means exploring ways in which they can be part of the prevention of the solution. And for us all, reflecting on how business and philanthropy can converge and go together. Humanitarian Alternative Review devoted 2 issues to businesses and NGOs, the maturity of a debate and NGOs and the private sector, threat or opportunity. They attempt to cover the evolution of the relations between 2 sectors that have long ignored or contempted each other with mutual distrust, when not outright arrogance. Actually, to quote one of the authors, a growing number of examples illustrate that NGOs may no longer be the sole purveyors of honorable intentions. The arrival of businesses in the humanitarian field is exponential and an almost irrepressible movement, and NGOs are fundamentally today subject to the same functional rules. Actually, it may not be that simple. First, the question of impartiality. Indeed, it is particularly difficult for businesses to be impartial in pre- or post-conflict situations. Specific issues call into question both ethics and geopolitics. Hiring private security companies, negotiating with parties to the conflict, intervening in areas where the donor may have interest other than humanitarian, and of course, certain donors' requirements with respect to counter-terrorism. The United States, where for-profit development companies are clearly comfortable with their ties to the political sphere and pursue overtly the goals of US foreign policy, remain way ahead of Europe, where it nevertheless gaining momentum. The recent example of the French group Lafarge, suspected of having paid the Islamic State in order to continue their activities in Syria during the conflict, is worth mentioning. Regarding accountability, it is fair to recall a meaningful differentiating feature between those 2 sectors. NGOs are motivated by a set of values, while businesses are ultimately motivated by profitability. It is clear that businesses see beneficiaries more as consumers, leading to a kind of competition of 2 very different forms of accountability. The lack of transparency is also a recurrent problem. Private companies hardly share, or not at all, information on results and impact of their activities, and usually stay away from aid coordination mechanism, making complementarity between actors more complex and hazardous. Beyond these humanitarian preoccupations on principles, I believe that some aspects of NGOs' expertise can be useful to businesses in the way they relate to the environment, authorities, partners, and local businesses. Good practices of the NGO sector, such as participation, inclusion, do no harm, could help lower tensions with communities and improve the acceptance level and coherence of various actors. On the question of risk aversion, although differences in the acceptable level of risk will continue to prevail, businesses can benefit from the ways in which NGOs assess, relate, and deal with the risk surrounding their program and personnel. The question of a context-specific approach is a crucial one. Private companies are frequently criticized for their misunderstanding of intercultural stakes and their lack of appropriate technical knowledge in aid. Actually, both businesses and NGOs are tempted to follow established models in the belief that they can apply everywhere. Both should learn to secure well-established knowledge and understanding of a given situation, while remembering the apparent paradox that the more you learn about a situation, the more its complexities make you feel that you know little. And from an HI perspective specifically, businesses working in post-conflict settings must understand the disabling legacies of war and should consider the higher rates of disability among the workforce in a fractured and dislocated context. By preparing themselves to do so with exemplary policies in regards to the employment of marginalized groups, businesses may be a major player in a reconstruction phase. HIs have signed numerous contracts with businesses willing to improve their policy of professional inclusion in such situations. On their part, NGOs could certainly learn from businesses' practices of collective approach and negotiations in consortiums through chambers of commerce that are much more powerful than individual ventures. I would also like to mention a good example of filling the ditch, the hybrid model, half business, half NGO, developed in the recent years. One of them is the Lebanese NGO Arc-en-Ciel, or Rainbow, that HI has supported when it was created in the middle of the civil war, therefore in a politically and religiously fractured environment. The young association, much like Brach in Bangladesh, chose a profit-making activities supporting non-profit activities model, with the ambition to participate to the development through the inclusion of persons in difficulty. Today, the association has a budget of $15 million and is self-funded to 72%. To conclude, I would like to stress that growing tensions in the world will create more situations hardly compatible with business as usual, as other speakers said. And apart from arms deals and some dark businesses, conflict situation, post-conflict devastation, and chaos are obviously not conducive to the restoration of economic activities necessary to the well-being of the population. Then, coming back to solution, I wish to raise the question of influence and its modalities in relation to the United Against Inhumanity initiative. Of course, businesses should have written policies regarding banking with, investing in illegal weapons such as anti-personnel mines and cluster munitions by the law. Indeed, businesses can play a role in the prevention of conflict. Businesses can play a role in promoting restraint by warring parties. When a conflict proves inevitable, investors can contribute to convince them of the benefit of limiting devastation so that business activities can restart early on, contributing to restore access of population to basic services as early as possible. It would certainly be interesting to see NGOs and businesses come closer together to reflect collectively on what could persuade antagonist parties to preserve or better preserve civilian population, but also civilian infrastructures and equipments from the devastation of war.
Actually, a lot of what I'd like to illustrate with reference to the work that I've done in the last few years touches on some of your points as well. And I think a successful business is one that's trying to solve a problem somewhere. And in that way, I think this line between NGOs and businesses, and we now have a new category of impact businesses or social enterprises, I think we're all trying to do the same thing, which is solve problems. For me, if I can leave you with one thought, it's that I think today we actually have a very exciting opportunity and a new tool in our toolbox to address problems, which is the use of digital technology. And I'd like to talk a little bit about that and why I think that's exciting as we look forward. And I'll try and do that by illustrating some of what I've done over the last 15 years. And in fact, if you take the last 15 years, what's happened with the advent of mobile technology has been astonishing. There hasn't been a technology that's pervaded so quickly into society as mobile technology. And let's think a little bit about what that does. It gives us a location, it gives us the ability to communicate. We've now got smartphones that cost less than $40, and those are very rich interfaces between a service provider and a consumer, and that just simply didn't exist 15 years ago. And if we take that sort of kernel of technology and apply it into fragile states or post-conflict states, or even I wouldn't necessarily class East Africa, where we do business, as a fragile state, but we see lots of problems on the ground that relate to the lack of infrastructure, and yet we've got this fantastic mobile infrastructure that we can use to our advantage and to solve problems for consumers. And so what do we do today in M-KOPA? Well, there's lots of cash out there in the real economy, and money moves around very slowly. What we can do because of the advent of mobile payments is move money between 2 points very quickly at a very low cost. And M-PESA's a great example of that in East Africa. It's now used by 30 million people in Kenya. In fact, 85 million people, the first payment transaction they do in sub-Saharan Africa will be on a mobile phone. And if you think about that, that's quite astonishing, given the fact we spent centuries moving cash around. Now people are moving small amounts of money around over their mobile phones, and money's moving between A and B in seconds, and it's moving across borders in seconds. And I'd like to keep that thought in mind as we think about some potential opportunities. And yes, we know where those people are. There's a full digital trail around every transaction that happens on a mobile phone. When we first launched M-PESA, there was a lot of concern out there. Isn't this going to lead to money laundering? Well, the opposite is true, because you know where money gets put in, you know where it goes out, you know which phones are related to the account that has the bank account associated with it. And so you actually have a level of transparency and visibility that didn't exist before. So transparency and visibility are also things I think we need to keep in mind as we think about opportunities. And so running on the back of M-PESA in Kenya, we thought, okay, what are the other problems? Now we can move a little bit of money around at a very low cost. What other problems can we solve? And today in sub-Saharan Africa, 600 million people do not have access to the power grid, and they'll spend small amounts of money, like 50 cents a day, on a litre of kerosene, which will give them light, and they might use kerosene for cooking. That's crazy, 50 cents for a litre of fuel, which is dirty, unsafe. You know, it's being burnt in a household that's often a small household. And it was a phrase used many years ago as the poverty penalty, and it sort of seems to have gone out of fashion, but it might come back in. People are paying a crazy amount for a very poor energy source. And we said, look, it doesn't have to work like that anymore. We'll take solar energy equipment, which is now much more affordable, so solar panels, lithium-ion batteries, LED lights. We'll package all of that together for a household that's potentially very far from the grid. We'll put some mobile technology inside that hardware so we can see it on the network, we can turn it on and we can turn it off, and we'll give it to the customer on our balance sheet as credit. We'll take a loan risk, say take this equipment away. If you want it to work, you've got to send me 50 cents by M-PESA or MTN Mobile Cash or MasterCard QR payment. It doesn't matter how that money comes to me. If I see a digital payment coming in, I can make that equipment work. And so suddenly I've made it affordable for them, because we simply said, instead of 50 cents a day on kerosene, 50 cents a day, and you are buying an asset, and I'll finance it for you, and over time I'll give you access to other forms of credit. So today we have about 650,000 customers who have taken our products in East Africa. We've moved beyond just lighting. We're now selling lots of televisions, and we could have a big debate about the social impact of televisions, but actually it's huge, because suddenly they're watching soaps. We had a discussion earlier today. I think there are 20 free-to-air digital TV channels you can now get in East Africa, and suddenly people are getting access to information that they wouldn't have dreamt of years ago, and simply no way of getting it. And so, maybe it's a good academic research area. Is a television a good thing in a household or a bad thing? But it's happening. We're now taking the same model and applying it to fridges. So cold storage is a huge issue. Nigeria, 70% of dairy products, milk, is powdered and sold as a powdered form, because there's no cold storage in the value chains. There's no cold storage because people haven't figured out how to take small distributed power, efficient DC refrigerators, and allow customers to buy those in small payments. We can solve those sorts of problems now using digital technology. And so I'm excited, actually. When I look forward for the next 10 years, I think there are many, many applications of digital technology. The biggest one for me, and the most exciting one, and there's been some work recently in India about this, but it's identity. A phone gives a person an identity, and that has lots of soft benefits with it. You have an identity, then you exist, and someone knows where you are and where you are and what you're doing. That can be a good or a bad thing, but I think generally it's a good thing, especially for displaced people, like refugees. I think they can have an identity. We can send to that mobile wallet some funds of some sort, so digital money, and we think about all the money that flows across borders in times of trouble. It's huge, and it often goes as cash, and that leaks. We can put systems in place that will now allow money to move account to account with full visibility and transparency. And I think we should really start to think about how we can support people in refugee camps using digital funds transfer. Those don't even have to be turned back to cash. With digital currency, you can make it a closed loop. So you could even start to think about, well, you can just encash this coupon for some other service that's perhaps made available through the NGOs or people on the ground. You don't need money in the loop anymore. Good old-fashioned cash, which comes with all the problems that cash brings. So for me, that's quite exciting, and you could go maybe a little bit further, and there's still not many good examples. We start to think about digital ledgers. Those of you that have followed the travails of Bitcoin, I wouldn't advocate we go into the sort of coin realm, but certainly what digital ledgers bring is transparency and contracts which can be made between two parties and can be proven. You can lock up through various digital ledgers. You can lock up records of transactions between parties that are irrefutable. For me, that's an exciting opportunity. I don't think anybody's yet figured out how to use that in a development context, but it will come, because now we have digital technology, we have very good networks, and we have devices in people's hands that are very powerful. So I think when I was asked to sort of sit on the panel and talk a little bit about the future, I actually think if we jump forward another 10 years, I think a lot of the problems that we try to deal with, especially around money flow and identity and goods and services, I think we suddenly have another set of things that we can use to tackle the problem.
It's good. Tomorrow, corruption will be traceable.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Well, that's true. I wanted to give the example earlier, but when we built M-Pesa, one of the very first use cases was in Nairobi. You used to get stopped all the time by the traffic police, and you always had to carry 20, it's a little bit of money, $20 or $10 in your pocket. One of the very first use cases for my project manager, somebody called Susie Loney, I think Rajesh, you might have met her. She's very forthright. She got stopped by the police, and she said, you're a foreigner, what are you doing in my country? And he was clearly lining her up to get some money. She goes, well, I'm here, I'm building a mobile money, but let me show you how it works. And so she took her phone out, and because you could send money to somebody who doesn't have a wallet. And so she sent him, I think it was like 1,000 shillings or something. And he was very happy. And he said, okay, you can take that to that shop over there and cash it in, and it'll give you money. And so he said, I don't believe you. So he made Susie drive to the agent location. He cashed it out and everything was fine. But I think it's a little known story that one of our first use cases on M-Pesa was bribing a policeman. But
And you mentioned the India example. So when the Reserve Bank of India did the first tests of identity, to your point about identity and the digital signatures and sending government payments
Yes.
Directly to people's bank accounts,
Yes.
if once they're able to identify. And they did an experiment, treatment to control, and in what they discovered in the treatment group was far fewer people were taking these up, because it turned out in the control group, with business as usual, it was all these ghost individuals who were basically collecting government money when they didn't exist. They were dead or invented. And so
it's not infallible, but I think I think we'll figure out those sorts of problems, and I think that India stack, which is often referred to, because it's identity, a welfare estate accounts, and then they've allowed non-banks to come in and move money around. And up until 10 years ago, they'd locked out non-banks. Only the sort of regulated banks could play. But I think it does have problems. But it's like all things. Those are teething issues in my mind. We'll be able to solve a lot of those.
I also remember when you were early in the Vodafone journey, the Philippines was the success story in mobile money, but it goes back to implementation. You could do more with it if you think differently. So just because someone's done it seemingly successfully in one place doesn't mean the story is over. There's a lot more one could do.
That's absolutely true.
Lars.
Right. So I'm coming from this from. I actually started my career as a military in the Swedish military, and I was hijacked into the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. I was highly institutionalized. Worked government, and then from there I went into the United Nations and had a pretty good career in the United Nations as well, in the Department of Peacekeeping Operations. Served mostly in Africa and ended up in Afghanistan in 2002. The reason we came, and my wife and I started the business back in 2004 in Afghanistan is, if you recall that in the first Gulf War, the US Army started outsourcing some of the logistics needs to private companies. In the second Gulf War, they were into even more services-related business as well. The UN had a huge staffing problem at the time, massive staffing costs. They were doing everything in-house and everything. And there were smaller companies now, and they were looking at outsourcing. And they started outsourcing to a few businesses. My wife and I were on the inside of the UN, kind of looking at that, and we saw the type of business they were setting up. They were highly profitable, no responsibility, and we called them cowboy outfit, really. But we saw an opportunity there. So in 2004, we decided, let's give it a shot, but let's do it a little bit differently. And let's bring with us what we had with us in the UN. So we implemented an ethical approach to what we're doing. It was compliance-led. And we tried to change the industry that we're in, literally. It's come at the cost, obviously. There was many opportunities for us. We got invited to Iraq several times back in 2004 to 2006. We went on a few missions there and to look at business opportunities, but it was no way of doing business in Iraq at the time without being corrupt, and we just said no to that. It's not for us. We managed to sustain a business in Afghanistan from 2004 to 2010, when the situation became a bit too complicated and corruption was just not possible to operate it anymore. So we pulled out. These are the costs that or the decisions we've taken from a business perspective that's kind of lost money for the business. But at least it makes me and my wife and the rest of the company sleep well at night and with a clean conscience. What we do is really, we work mainly for United Nations, not only DPKO, but many of the agencies, UNICEF and UNHCR, are two big organizations for us. We work for the British Minister of Defense and FCO. We work for US State Department and so on. And what we're offering is remote site solutions. So when the UN, UNHCR, or UNICEF in this case, for instance, now they needed to move in, the donor community said you can no longer sit in Nairobi and manage Somalia. You have to sit in Mogadishu. That came with a huge problem for them. How do you sustain a workforce of 40, 45 international staff, while they have to do work? They have a mandate to fulfill. So do they bring in another 20 people to take care of those 40 people, or can they outsource it? And that's where we come in. So we build them the accommodation, we'll build them the infrastructure they need. We take care of them in terms of catering and cleaning, and we do healthcare services for them. We do pest and vector controls to make sure that there is no malaria or mosquitoes or rats or rabies-infected dogs or whatever around the compounds. We do waste management, which UN in the past have been highly criticized for, in Kosovo, for instance. This is now outsourced to private companies like ours, and we do it in a sustainable way, in an environmentally sound way. We do all this as a private business, so we make money off it. It is a viable business for us. The margins are good. We are by many said to be war profiteers, and sure, that's we can live with that in one way. We got data on it, again coming from the UN background and working very, very closely with the UN. We're normally 1/5 of the price of UN doing the business themselves. So we are saving money for the UN in many ways. For the UK MOD, we're even 1/10 cheaper than if they do it themselves, particularly in construction. So it is, now this year we're fortunate as well. We managed to actually become a publicly listed company on the London Stock Exchange as well. So we've always tried to improve ourselves by being, driven by compliance and ethics. We have, as I said, a zero tolerance policy on corruption, and we managed to hold that. The key for what I liked with this conference was the question, so what can business do in post-conflict or in fragile states? And what I brought with me here to the discussions we've had here is that, it's the local staff, local employment. That's the key to the business, I think. Again, coming from the UN background, my wife ran a project called Village Employment Rehabilitation Project within the UN, which is basically train the local population to work for the projects that needs to be implemented in infrastructural projects. You equip them with the tools, and once the project is finished, they have the tools, they have the skills, and then they can, start their own business and carry on. So we took that with us, and we do that in the company as well. Certain countries like Somalia, we run 45% local staff. That's for security concerns, not from our perspective, but actually from our clients, who set restrictions on Somali employees within certain security aspects of the business we're doing. In Central African Republic, we run 94% local staff. And it's what we're particularly proud of is there's 11% of that is women. And then you have to bear in mind that in Central African Republic at the moment, all we do is construction. So it's only construction. If you take that number, 11% females in construction industry in Central African Republic, and you apply that to UK, you run 13% here. So, and that's secretarial duties, that's all the admin parts as well. Ours is core workmen in construction sites. So we're quite proud of that. We think this is something that is very important, and it's something we try to advocate with other businesses, our competitors, to do the same. It's not as simple as just saying that local staff is important. It's also to promise or to keep them. So it's long-term employment is the key, actually. What we do, obviously this comes with some tricky obstacles for a company as well, because how do you promise someone lifetime employment? You can't do that, but if you continuously train people, and what we do when we come into a country as well, so because you don't have maybe the skill set that you need, but what we do is when we recruit people, we pay them for the skills that they will have once we train them. So they're already paid, a decent wage, a high wage actually, compared to the local market. We train them up to that skills level, but we've invested in them, and they know that from the beginning, and you have a better possibility of retaining staff like this. We actually rolled them over as well. So many of our local staff from Chad, for instance, we were there for a number of years, are now working with us in Central African Republic or in Somalia. We have several of the Afghan staff from the early operations working with us across Africa. We have a total of 39 nationalities in the company at the moment. So, more profiteering, probably a little bit. You know, publicly listed company. We have shareholders to placate, but I think we're doing an okay business.
Thank you, Lars. Can I just follow up on one of the striking numbers you shared? 1/5 to 1/10 of the cost, and as a publicly listed company, you know, we can look you up on profits, and you're profitable, I'm assuming. And what do you attribute that? Is that just specialization, that you really know how to build? Is it? What do you attribute that to?
I think if you compare to the UN or MOD, you know, the way they do it, they bring in foreigners only. I mean, so I think again, you know, the local content, which is the buzzword, is not only like an ethical way of doing it. It's a business, a sound business decision as well. You know, it is you know, staff cost, the burden cost of staff, not only the salaries but the travels, the insurances, the pension funds. You know, it stacks up. You have to accommodate people, right? If you compare an international staff, regardless of where they come from in the world, with a local staff, you know, your burden cost will be greatly different between them. So it's obviously a cheaper option to go local as well. But I still think it's an obligation as well to do it. You know? So.
But then in contexts like that, people often say, "Well, I'm in South Sudan. I can't get, you know, international standard skilled workers." How do you deal with that?
Well, you train them. So obviously we don't go into Central African Republic and say, "Boom, 94% local staff." You know, that's not how it works. I mean, we come in and we are in the beginning. You know, I'd say we're 94% international staff. You know, but then we're maybe 10 guys on the ground, and we're starting to work, and then we'll start slowly integrated people in. And as we get the projects going, you know, we transition from the international staff to local staff, and we train and upskill, train, upskill all the time. You know, and then you transition out, and eventually, you know, now we're 2.5, 3 years into Central African Republic, we're at 94%.